We want to welcome you into worship today. We're excited that you're here with us. Those of you that are curious about Popeye, we will get to that eventually. We're not starting a new series today. We're just talking about something that's heavy on my heart lately. And so we're going to do this week before we start something new next week. When I think about my life and the lives of the people around me, there are questions that sometimes keep me up at night pondering their answers. I think about questions like this. What is it that motivates people to work where they work? Why do they volunteer their time at the places that they serve? Why do they donate money to the causes that they support? Put more simply, why do people do what they do? And I wonder if you've ever really thought about that. Why do builders build? Why do writers write? Why do teachers teach? Why do painters paint? What is it that compels people to give the vast majority of their waking hours to occupations such as these? In truth, the answer is probably deeper than to just get a paycheck. The reason I know that is that many of us pour hours of our time into roles and responsibilities that don't pay a single dime. In any given year, it is estimated that American adults volunteer roughly 20 billion hours of their time. And I've talked to people in all walks of life, in hospitals and ministry programs, other nonprofit groups, schools, charities, and other worthwhile organizations. And they all agree that their programs would crumble if not for the volunteer environment. The annual dollar value on that volunteering is somewhere around $225 billion. And that's an old statistic. Roughly the gross national product of the country of Austria. Add into that the amount of money that we donate and things start to get pretty interesting. But why? I want to talk to you folks about Moses just a little bit this morning. I know most of you know his story well. What I want to look at this morning, though, is that what was the underlying motivation that fueled Moses' primary achievement of his life, which was leading his people out of captivity and into the promised land. Let's go back to the story in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. It's one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them hard at labor. You know, Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And although he was accustomed to a very posh lifestyle, he still recognized the Hebrews as his people. And essentially, Pharaoh was building a thriving economy on the weary backs of this Hebrew slave labor. Now, the work ethic demanded by the Egyptian overlords was merciless, and it was day after day. Hebrew men with no rights and little hope for freedom were pushed past the point of exhaustion in sweltering midday sun as they made bricks for Pharaoh's vast construction programs. It's in this context that we find Moses out scoping out the town, and his heart grows heavy as he sees firsthand the repulsive oppression of his people that were being forced to deal with. The situation worsens when Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Being slaves was bad enough, but now his people are being abused and beaten too. And he couldn't just stand by and watch. Moses had to do something. Have you ever seen a real fight? I don't mean on TV or in a movie. I mean right in front of you, two people going at it in an altercation where one is being physically beaten by the other. I actually have a couple of times, and it's a sickening thing to see someone beaten and unable to defend themselves. This is what Moses is seeing here in Exodus chapter 2. He just can't stand this terrible sight and the heart-wrenching sounds and the splattering of blood. The injustice of the situation is far too much for Moses to take, and suddenly something inside of him snaps. Verse 12 says, looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And now Moses is horrified by his capacity for violence himself. And he buries the Egyptian in the sand and he runs away. But the very next day, Moses went back out to watch again. And what did he see? Verse 13, the next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? So two Jews were fighting each other. Fists were flying, teeth are shattering. Noses are breaking. These were the same sights and sounds that he'd heard the day before. And Moses screamed, "Stop! After all you've been through, how can you fight each other?" It was obvious to Moses that his people were imploding. They'd been exposed to such hatred and violence for so long that they were probably just ready to wipe each other out if left to their own devices. The appalling abuse and the oppression and the exploitation that they'd suffered under Pharaoh's rule had escalated to a level of total insanity. And Moses now finds himself at the extreme edge of his emotional limits. That's it. He must have cried out. I've had it. I just can't stand it anymore. Later in Exodus, there's a famous exchange between God and Moses beside a burning bush. Now, when I was a kid, I remember the story, and I thought that the sight of the burning bush that day utterly scared Moses into helping to free his people from Egypt's control. But after years of consideration since then, the burning bush was more likely just an attention grabber to get Moses to slow down long enough to hear God convey a level of empathy that most of us never think to ascribe to him. And the tactic worked with Moses here. And I'm going to paraphrase here. I'm obviously not God, okay? But I think this conversation between the two of them probably went something like this from God. Moses, I understand the rage that you feel. And I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I too have heard them crying out. I too have felt their anguish as they suffer. What you saw when the Egyptian guy was beating that Hebrew slave, and then you saw the two Hebrew guys fighting, I saw those things too. And for what it's worth, I hate the suffering as much as you do. More, actually. And I'm so stirred in my spirit that I've decided to intervene from heaven. I've chosen to rescue them, and I want to use you to help me. I've been waiting for someone like you. If you will participate in my plan, then I will harness the internal firestorm that rages inside you and channel it into positive action that will help set my people free from their slavery. I'm going to assign you a specific role because I see that you are stirred up here on earth as I am in heaven about this issue. I can see what it's doing to you on the inside. I see the passion for your people. In your raw emotion, I see a man with tremendous capacity for activism. A man who refuses to stand by idly while his people are being dreadfully mistreated. Your frustration can forge leadership mettle and fortitude, Moses, if you will let it. Now let's take a little sidebar for a minute. Now we're going to get to Popeye. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember Popeye. We were playing some videos so that you could hear a phrase if you were able to watch it. Many years ago, some of you will remember this, families would gather around on their couches on Saturday morning as the sailor with the corncob pipe and the one good eye would engage in his next exciting adventure. Now, Popeye had a special girl in his life named Olive Oil. She was a real traffic stopper, folks. She had a flat chest and a pickle nose, spaghetti thin arms, quite the looker, all right? But whenever someone cramped the style of his special Goyle, Popeye called her a Goyle, not a girl, and as he called her, Popeye typically would take it in stride. He was good-natured. He had a long fuse, and on most occasions, he was the epitome of calm, cool, and collected. But if things took a menacing tone, if it looked like something might go terribly wrong with his beloved Olive Oil, then Popeye the sailor man's pulse would race, and his blood pressure would skyrocket, and his anger would begin to boil. And he would take it as long as he could, but once his fuse burned up, Popeye would blurt out the words that an entire generation had branded into their psyche. That's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more. Anybody remember that? Yeah. That's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more. And the now enraged Popeye would rip open a can of spinach with his bare hands, shoot it up there, and he'd swallow that gross lump in his giant gulp. And immediately a stream of supernatural strength flowed to his body. Most of it went to his forearms for some reason. And he would instantly bulk up to quadruple their normal size, giving Popeye the strength to be an unstoppable force for good in the world. And he crushed the opposition in no time and saved his precious olive oil from all sorts of distress. And then once life had returned to its steady state, he'd sing himself off the screen, "I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eats me spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man." And do you know that because of that, for a while, a lot of kids started to eat spinach? But Popeye left behind a more important legacy than that. He said, "That's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more." This is a very important line that I want you to think about. You see, for Moses, he could no longer tolerate his fellow Hebrews being oppressed and beaten. He just couldn't stand it. And this was his Popeye moment, okay? God used the firestorm within Moses' soul to launch this unlikely leader into a prominent role that resulted in the nation of Israel eventually inhabiting the promised land. Who remembers another story about a little boy who's bringing food to his older brothers at the front lines of a war? Little David showed up to see the Israelites scared and immobile as he heard the giants screaming across the landscape, their insults at the army of God, against God and the army. And David heard that for a while and said, "I've had all I can stand, and I can't stand no more, this little boy." And he walked into battle armed with shepherd's tools and defeated a giant. This helped shape the changes in the nation of Israel, which would eventually include David becoming the king. Anybody remember Jesus walking into the temple? And he discovered the merchants in there treating it like a market. And he cleared it with righteous anger. He could not stand that they were defiling his father's temple. See, Moses and David aren't the only people in history motivated by a Popeye moment to take something in the hand and make a difference in the world. And if you ask people why they get involved with things that consume their time, their money, their volunteer energy, we might find something surprising about what inspires us to do the things that we do and volunteer the ways that we volunteer. And it all hinges on this, folks. The reason why millions of people do good in the world around them is because there's something wrong in the world. In fact, there's something wrong and they just can't stand it. Like Popeye, they experience this firestorm of frustration and they go completely incensed with the current state of affairs that they throw their hands up in the air and shout, "That's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more." And people steer their vocational lives, their volunteer energies, and their hard-earned money to making sure that it gets fixed. There was a great book I read many years ago, and that was the title of this sermon you saw this morning, and it calls this "A Holy Discontent." A holy discontent within us. We have a massive history-altering turn of events that gets these Hebrew people in the story of Moses free from hundreds of years of spirit-squelching slavery, and yet the whole deal can be traced back to a simple alliance between God and a normal, everyday, earthbound human being who happened to find himself stirred up by the exact same thing that stirred the heart of the Creator. That was Moses' holy discontent. And this theory still works today. What wrecks the heart of someone who loves God is often the very thing that God wants to use to fire them up to do something that under normal circumstances they would never attempt to do. Whether you're a high-powered executive or a stay-at-home mom or a 9-to-5 clock puncher or a full-time student or something altogether different, and yes, you can join God in making what is wrong in this world right. And it starts with you finding your holy discontent. It begins with you determining what it is that you just can't stand. Even the most optimistic people in our world agree that there's plenty wrong in it today. Romans 8:21 says, "For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." Everything that is broken in this world will someday be redeemed. And that's what God is focused on every minute of every day. He's working to call the world back to its original beauty and promise. If you expose yourself to all that's broken in the world without viewing the brokenness from heaven's perspective, then you will be sucked into the impossible. Things will become so bleak that you'll find yourself taking up residence in your own firestorm of frustration instead of allowing it to propel you towards a positive action. I want to share with you now a few ordinary people that had Popeye moments, okay, and helped to shape the world. He was a preacher who wound up being one of the greatest volunteers that the world has ever known. Racial oppression ripped him apart. Whites-only signs on drinking fountains and bathrooms and restaurant doors. Law dictated that blacks were pushed to the back of buses or forced to give up their seats altogether so that white people could sit down. He couldn't stand the fact that his people were always found at the end of the receiving line for education, for employment, and for housing opportunities. Sound a little like Moses? Right? He wanted the lynching of black people to stop. He wanted segregation banished. He wanted justice to be served so that his kids could grow up in a different world than the one he was living in. Then the day finally came when that thing he couldn't stand simply got the best of him. And the holy discontent he felt in the depth of his being brought him to the point where he must have said in the privacy of his own soul, God, that's all I can stand, and I can't stand anymore. He lived the rest of his life with ravenous passion for seeing a new civilization ushered in. One characterized by nonviolence and freedom and justice. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize. And during his speech, he said, I refuse to accept the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. Church, that is what it looks like to live from a place of holy discontent, where oughtness simply overtakes the isness. Martin Luther King knew that his activism would probably cost him his life. And in April 1968, it did. I believe that the holy discontent that had taken up residence inside him simply wouldn't allow him to give anything less than his entire life. His mind, his spirit, his soul, and his body for this worthy goal. And a sniper took his life, but could not steal his legacy. Agnes Gansha, I don't even know if I can say this right, Bojaxhiu, was an average geography teacher in Calcutta. And every morning she would make her way to St. Mary's High School to inspire young minds. But all around her, the conditions were anything but inspiring. Life on the streets was deplorable. Her route to work took her right by men and women who were homeless and destitute and incapacitated by disease. Every day, something in her spirit would cry out, that's all I can stand, and I can't stand doing this anymore. And ultimately, that gut-wrenching poverty that assaulted her senses and wrecked her soul day in and day out thrust her into solution mode. She secured the necessary permission to quit her job teaching, rallied a few of her former students, and set to the work of rescuing men, women, and children who'd been rejected by the local hospitals and were literally dying in the streets. Now, initially, this ragtag team of do-gooders all they could afford was this small, rented space where they would administer care. But still, that warm room was a vast improvement for the folks who'd been lying in open sewers the day before. The saint of the gutters had been born. In the 1950s, she received permission from the Vatican to launch her own order, now known as the Missionaries of Charity. I read recently that what began with a dozen or so volunteers has more than 4,000 nuns who are all working diligently to ensure that refugees, alcoholics, victims of epidemics, drug addicts, prostitutes, the homeless, blind, the disabled, the deaf, and the poor are all being cared for. From those beginnings, she could be found every day holding the hand of a terminally ill person or escorting wayward street children to safe houses, or cleansing the open sores of lepers, or amassing funds to feed disease-riddled and bloated-bellied people living in these developing countries. But more impressive than all of those numbers is the fact that it can all be tracked back to one woman who just couldn't stand the idea of anyone, even the poorest of the poor, especially the poorest of the poor, was dying without hope and was dying without dignity. Mother Teresa didn't devote herself to this cause because of a fat paycheck every month. She served the under-resourced people right in her midst because her holy discontent had her by the throat and would not let her go. And still one more story of holy discontent. In 1950, an American businessman experienced a firestorm of frustration in his heart. He watched in disbelief as little children who'd been orphaned by the Korean War in third world Asia dropped dead while standing in line for food. And when he went seeking answers as to why, he learned that there just wasn't enough food at the front of the line. In what can only be considered a dramatic Popeye moment right here, he headed back to the United States. He gathered his most affluent business partners together in a meeting room in Los Angeles, and together they birthed the reality known today as World Vision. We're going to get food to the front of those food lines, he declared. If it kills me, we're going to do it. Dr. Bob Pierce cried this out, and in truth, it did almost kill him. But his persistence paid off. On one overseas visit, he had given all the money he had on him to a little girl named White Jade, who came from this poor Asian family who was beaten and disowned after announcing the fact that she'd become a Christian. His $5 bill was just enough to provide her with food and clothing and schooling, and know that the one thing she needed more than anything was hope for the future. He pledged to send her money every month from then on. And this small, seemingly spur-of-the-moment gesture served as the catalyst for what would become World Vision's elaborate child sponsorship program, now active in hundreds of countries around the globe. Through World Vision's efforts, more than 100 million people in more than 100 countries have received physical, social, and spiritual support. In other words, there's now food at the front of the line. Just think of the thousands of White Jades, the little girl whose lives have been radically enriched because of Pierce's determination. And here we see it again. It all started with a single heart-wrenching area of holy discontent that forced one man to get into the game. A few years ago, there was a movie that came out, told the story of Desmond Doss, who hated war and wanted no part in hurting people. But he also couldn't stand to see what was happening in his hometown when people would get the news that a family member of theirs had died in the war. And he wanted to help. And he went through tremendous hardship to join the army and then join the medical corps, where he refused to carry a gun. And he was oppressed, and just all kinds of things happened to him because he wouldn't carry that gun. He was determined to help and heal, but not to harm. His bravery saved the lives of 75 men on Hacksaw Ridge. And I tell you all these stories to ask you a question. What is it that you can't stand? There are all kinds of crazy things happening in our country right now. And it doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you find yourself on. Jesus says, whatever you have done for the least of these, you have done for me. Does your political agenda, does your bumper sticker, do your social media posts reflect the heart of Jesus? And some people are standing up. Some people are being shouted down. Anger is pointed in places where it shouldn't be. And in many ways, our personal freedoms make it easy for us to ignore the freedoms that are being taken away from others. I'm so glad Jesus never said, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give shelter to the unhoused, unless they're from another country, or unless they are a different color, or unless you pay taxes into our political agenda. None of these things would come from the mouth of our King. I think Jesus would take a look at the things happening here right now and say, I can't stand it no more. And you might be telling yourself, there's somebody smarter, there's somebody richer, stronger, feistier, more talented, more ambitious, more energetic, more persistent, more creative than me. It would be easy to opt out of this calling. It would be easy to tell yourself that this holy discontent inside of you is reserved for someone else besides you. But friends, you would be dead wrong. Countless trees have been killed in the name of explaining the issue of why you were put here. But there is a single verse of Scripture that sheds as much light on this situation as anything else. Ephesians 2:10 says that we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. We were created to do good works. I was created to do good works. Just as confidently as I am here, sitting here telling you that you were created to do good works. And you know what that tells me? Is that you have a holy discontent banging around somewhere in your heart, somewhere in your mind, somewhere. If you're alive and kicking today, then there is a specific work from God that you are expected to do. There's a set of tasks with your name on it, and that God has given to you to accomplish. And long before you ever arrived on the scene, God planted certain seeds in your soul that he remains wholeheartedly committed to watering and growing and making it into something meaningful if you will let him. There's a verse in the Bible that says, once we turn our lives over to God, we begin the process of becoming transformed into his image. And over time, Christ followers should, in fact, begin to look less like themselves and more like Christ. We start to loosen the grip on our self-centeredness, and we look for ways to serve others. And as God works in our lives, turning us into fully devoted followers of Christ, and therefore into progressively and more compassionate people, many of society's ills should break our hearts and prompt us to take action of some sort. You guys can come up, worship team. However, in addition to being moved towards short-term, cause-inspired action, I think you constantly should be on the lookout for that one cause or purpose or problem that grabs you by the throat and just won't let you go. Your one thing is the stirring situation that caused so much damage to your soul that it brings you to your own Popeye moment. A place where you feel that you simply must do something. Your one thing births a burning bush experience in your soul where you sense God himself inviting you into an intentional and personalized partnership with him to renovate your reality. I'm going to close with this. God is looking for somebody just like you. Someone who gets wrecked on planet Earth by the things that wreck him up in heaven, so that he can sign you up for service. I assure you, there is a holy discontent with your name on it. There's something out there that God is waiting for you to grab onto so that he can use you to solve it. It wrecks you, it wrecks him, and he is ready for you both to do something about it. What can't you stand? I hope that many of you can't stand that people are living in love-starved lives, never knowing that there's a merciful God who created them and wired them in a unique way and has a plan for their lives here on earth. What is it that you can't stand? I hope that you, by now, you know that your answer to this all-important question, because you will never make as meaningful a contribution as when you operate from the energy of holy discontent.